What's up, sons? It's Blind Rod with Son of a Ticker once again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the performance benchmarks for the Surge on PC, so stick around. Starting things off as always, let's go over the test bench real quick. It's going to be i7-7700K mated to a gaming M3 Z270 motherboard from MSI. The memory is going to be DDR4 clocked at 2400 megahertz. It's a grand total of 16 gigabytes. And then the game itself is going to be running on an M.2 drive, 256 gigabyte over SATA. The benchmark run itself is going to be pretty early in the game, just so we don't spoil anything at all. And it will be after the second shortcut that you unlock. And I won't tell you how to get it, but I can show you the path that you will take. So once you've unlocked the second shortcut, at least once you've gotten to the semi-open area, not really open because it is a Souls-like game, right? But you're going to go ahead and start in the med bay, walk out, and then take the right down the stairs and follow that path all the way until you get to what I would consider a dead end. Turn to the right, hit a crate, turn back around and walk back to the starting area. I did clear out all the enemies before doing this benchmark. That way I didn't have to really worry about it, because the enemies do require a certain amount of skill that, if you don't have it, can make the game or the fights last longer. The problem with this is that if you actually go ahead and take a look at the numbers while you're fighting, you'll notice that they vary quite a lot. In fact, it does seem that, especially when it gets close in, just because of the way the game focuses on the enemies, is that the FPS goes through the roof. So in theory, if you're benchmarking this game and you're fighting the enemies, but you're not able to do the exact same hits with each and every benchmark run, you're going to get varied results that will make your benchmarks pretty inconsistent, if not completely just trash and not even worth taking a look at. I think this does also explain some of the variances you will see in the benchmark numbers between different websites and other YouTubers, so keep that in mind as we go through this video as well. So let's talk about settings. All the settings for the benchmarks themselves on the GPU is basically going to be at the default very high. I always like to use default, that way everybody knows where we're at, and if I lose track of my settings while I'm benchmarking, I can just go back and load the very high setting. There's also another note or point here to make, is that even though you may have closed the game and reopened it, let's say by with another GPU, for example, it can have issues where I did notice that the settings still weren't all applying. This was very evident when I was running the benchmarks for testing the settings chart, which we'll talk about here now. So if we go ahead and take a look at the percent change in FPS by setting at 1080p, you're going to see that the biggest setting you can change is going to be shadow quality, but hold on. The caveat to this is that this percentage difference is between very high shadows and shadows completely off. However, if you turn shadows completely off, you're going to have literally no shadows, which completely changes the look of the game inside buildings and around large objects that have any sort of lighting that are shooting from behind them camera-wise. So it looks really different and pretty much a lot worse, and it will not net you 30% just by turning it down to low. If you turn it down to low, you're going to see something more around a 16% change in FPS. Texture quality is also around that 16% change in FPS if you go from the highest quality textures to the lowest quality textures. Volumetric lighting is going to be around 10% change in FPS, and lens flare at 2.44% change in FPS. The rest of the settings pretty much netted us less than 1%, so you'll see them coming in with a big zilch, because you're not really going to gain anything from turning those on or off or up or down. It'll all be preference based on what is visually appealing to you. So before we hop into the benchmarks themselves, there's one other thing I need to clarify with everyone here, and that is going to be the driver version for the Radeon series GPUs. While I typically like to use Wickel series drivers just because those are the most verified or latest verified with Windows itself, they also are typically the most tried and true at this point. And if I'm using the latest Wickel drivers, that's also what Windows 10 theoretically is going to install automatically if you let the system do that or handle that for you. But in this case, there was an issue with the Radeon GPUs on the latest Wickel driver, which is 17.4.4. When trying to run the game on these drivers, there were some very serious artifacting issues to do with either shadowing or lighting, which I will show you here, where they essentially turned into a purple artifact. And this is no bueno. Obviously, this means that the driver has some issues and we can't use it. It did take me a little bit of troubleshooting, as I did go through every single setting and turn it all the way off to make sure it wasn't a setting in game that was causing it. And then finally I went ahead and loaded the latest non-Wickel drivers for Radeon, which is 17.5.1. The NVIDIA GPU drivers we went ahead and left at the latest Wickel, which was the 382.05. Now there is a later one that has just recently come out, which is the 382.19, which apparently made some changes for the microstuttering in Prey, but shouldn't affect the results of this benchmark for the Surge necessarily. So finally it's come down to it. Get ready to throw some blows. AMD and NVIDIA fanboys, let's see whose side wins. Alright, taking a look at the benchmark, obviously we already went over the settings for it. And let's start with the RX 550 2GB, which is going to have a minimum FPS of 20 with an average of 25.77 and a max of 31. Now a note about this card is the game doesn't actually recognize the GPU, so there could be some optimizations that come along later that improve the performance for this card. However, if you do turn some settings down, i.e. shadow quality and texture quality, it's pretty easy to net a playable 30 FPS experience at 1080p. Bumping up, we pretty much get at that 30 FPS playable experience on the RX 462 GB with a minimum of 29, an average of 37.18, and a max of 47. But it is beat out by the Green Team's GTX 1050 from Zotac, who had a minimum FPS of 33 with an average of 44.25 and a max of 66. One thing you will note here is, as we move through these, is that it does appear that the max frame rates are quite a bit higher on the GTX line or on the NVIDIA cards, and I do have a theory to this that we'll go over after these benchmarks. So the GTX 1050 Ti had a minimum of 38 with an average of 49.65 and a max of 74. The RX 474 GB gets as close to that 60 FPS ultra maxed out very high settings at 1080p with a min of 57, an average of 69.62. Did I say 69? And a max of 86. The EVGA GTX 1063 GB gets us even closer to that 60 FPS playable at very high settings with a min of 59, an average of 75.75, and a max of 111. Since I value the mins over anything else, the MSI RX 480 Gaming X Edition does beat out the 1063 GB in my analysis with a min of 63, an average of 72.02, and a max of 90. Finally, the GTX 1066 GB has a min of 65, an average of 83.42, and a max of 123. Now, as I mentioned earlier while we were speaking about these benchmarks, we do notice that the max FPS is quite high on the NVIDIA cards, and I was trying to figure out exactly why this is. I think I might know. We'll take a look at the side-by-sides here. And if you take a look here, it does appear that the RX 488 GB is able to retain a larger amount of textures or other information within its video memory, as it does sit around that 4100 mark, while the GTX 1060 is dipping down around the 4000 mark. Now, the reason this might be is because of two things. Well, A, the RX 480 is able to hold more information within its video memory before having to send it to the actual core for processing, and it has a larger bus or bandwidth, which means that at this point, that's probably why we also see a more consistent frame rate on the RX 480 over the GTX 1060 6GB. In my opinion, if you're going to be playing with like VSync off, your best option here is actually going to be the RX 480 8GB, in my personal opinion. But if you're just going for max frames overall, obviously the GTX 1060 for the win is where you're going to want to be, or the GTX 1060 6GB just in general, I should say. Another cool note while you're watching the side-by-side is you'll notice that we have the memory running at 2000 megahertz on the GTX 1060. Now this is out of the box. I don't change anything. I don't overclock anything. And this is all just GPU Boost 3.0 taking effect. Now, I don't know if this is just because of the latest WCL drivers coming from NVIDIA over the last game I tested, which was Prey. Actually, the NVIDIA drivers were the same. So I can say that obviously, since this game is aimed towards your NVIDIA or was optimized, or at least has it in its splash screen when it's opening up, that it does seem to appear to utilize the GPU boost to probably the greatest extent that I've seen any game in recent history be able to. So that's an interesting note as well. If you're looking at purchasing a PC, of course, for playing Prey, one more note is to take a look at the memory usage or the system memory usage, where you're going to want to see here that you're using about 4 gigabytes of system memory. So if you're building a system to play this game, you're going to want to be looking at a minimum of 8 gigabytes of system memory just to account for any Chrome tabs open, etc., etc. That's going to wrap up the benchmark review for the Surge. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below, and go check out my Patreon at patreon.com/sonofatech. If you are interested in getting any of these benchmark charts early, you can pay a solid $1 and get all of my benchmark charts early, or you can pay a little bit more and help me out with things like Adobe Premiere subscriptions, purchasing GPUs and other items for review on the channel, and of course purchasing items to increase the quality of the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next Tuesday.